Good evening, buenas noches, and thank you for tuning in. On behalf of all of us at the locally based, independently owned bookstore, Books and Books in Miami, Florida, and in partnership with Miami Book Fair, it's my pleasure to welcome you to a virtual evening with Mayukh Sen and Ellen Canner to discuss Tastemakers, 7 Immigrant Women Who Revolutionized Food in America, published by our friends at W. Norton and Company. Mayukh Sen is a James Beard and IACP award-winning writer based in Brooklyn. His work has been anthologized in 2 editions of The Best American Food Writing. He also teaches food writing at Columbia University. To moderate tonight's conversation, we are also joined by Ellen Canner, who is the soulful vegan award-winning author of Feeding the Hungry Ghosts: Life, Faith, and What to Eat for Dinner. She has been writing about the intersection of food, culture, wellness, and sustainability for over 20 years for outlets including HuffPost, Civil Eats, Veg News, the Miami Herald, and Whole Foods magazine. Throughout this evening's broadcast, you're invited to ask questions by using the Ask a Question feature at the bottom of the screen, and please order your copy of Tastemakers from Books and Books below by pressing the green button. It is so important to us that you continue to join these events, and we appreciate each and every order and the generous donations from viewers everywhere. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guests to the virtual stage.
Hello, how's it going, everyone? Thank you so much, Saviana, for that wonderful introduction. Hello, Ellen.
Hi, I'm so glad we are all here. Hi, everybody. And I'm so excited, Mayukh, to talk about your book.
Thank you. I'm excited too.
You had a winding path to Tastemakers. You started in film journalism, and then you were with Food 52, and then Tastemakers, 7 Immigrant Women Who Revolutionized Food in America. This book has gotten so much attention and acclaim, and we're going to find out why. But I was wondering if you'd like to give people an appetizer first.
Absolutely. What an apt word. Wonderful. First of all, thank you for the very kind words. Let's hope we don't disappoint the audience. But I'd love to just read a portion from my introduction. This shouldn't take too long. So here goes. One question may hang over you as you read this book. Why is a man writing this? It's a justified question. I'm aware that I present as a cis male to the public, and I prefer to use the privileges afforded to me because of that to amplify the voices of women, whom our cultural attention skews away from. I'm sensitive to the limits of this very hand, which is why I feel it is crucial to decenter myself in the process of writing, rather than interject or cast judgment on my subjects. The more elaborate response I have to such a concern is that I, like many queer-identifying people, have had a complex, evolving relationship to gender expression throughout my entire life. I realize that my appearance might belie this tension. This project is intensely personal, forged by my own sense of isolation in this field as a queer person of color. I began writing about food professionally in 2016 when I was 24. Even then, I could sense that I was writing from a center of gravity that differed from those of my peers as a queer child of Bengali immigrants to America. Early in my career, perhaps these feelings directed my narrative gaze towards story subjects who, like me, once felt that they did not belong. These figures tended to be people of color, queer people, women, or immigrants. Often they were even part of more than one of those groups. Their trajectories invigorated me. They floated on the margins of the food world when they first landed in it, only to push their way to the center by sheer force. These subjects had something to say. They were persuasive enough to get powerful people to listen. With time, I would come to understand what it's like to have people reduce me to my identity. The very aspects of myself that once seemed like liabilities, my queerness, my color, also started to make me, in a word, marketable. Actual engagement with the substance of my work was suddenly secondary to those superficial factors. No matter the case, the acute sense of alienation I entered this industry with does not fade easily. There will always be a sliver of me that feels as though I'm on the margins of the food world, the margins of this country's dominant social structures. Maybe the answer to why I gravitate towards the stories of these women lies somewhere in my identity, how lonely I often feel because of it, and what I create from that solitude. Around the time I wrote this book, I also weathered 2 particularly difficult losses. I lost my father to cancer in 2017, and I lost a best friend to mental illness in 2020. These deaths weighed on me. I found myself forgetting so much about these people who'd been such vital presences in my own life. Their voices, their mannerisms. I understood the fragility of memory, how easily the essence of a person can disappear once they're no longer around. Writing is one way of ensuring someone's story doesn't die along with them. The 7 women in this book have been my teachers. Through spending time with their stories, I have come to question and ultimately better understand my own place in America. I hope these women will inspire a similar journey for you. Thank you. That's all.
It's not all.
Goodbye, everyone.
You know, from a fairly, at least on the surface, glam-seeming background, Tastemakers went really deep and really dark. I mean, I'm wondering what made you say, yeah, this is a good idea. This is something I want to explore.
Totally. That's a great question. And I'm glad that you see that it tried to go deep and dark. So I first had the idea for this book all the way back in, I would say 2017. And at that point, I had just been a few months into my job at Food 52. And like I said in that introduction, you know, I very much felt marginalized within that space, within food media. And as a result, I really gravitated towards telling the stories of people who belong to marginalized communities like me. And oftentimes these were people of color, women of color, immigrant women of color, because I wanted to better understand just kind of my place in this industry and how to navigate it when there are so many challenges. And part of writing those stories too was educating myself because, as you noted earlier, I came from a non-food background. I got this job by accident at Food 52, and I was neither an avid home cook nor a restaurant enthusiast. And I have, stood firm by both of those stances, let's say, over the past 5 years. So I was educating myself and writing these stories of figures who were not as famous as people like, say, Julia Child or James Beard, even though they really deserve to be in my eye. And so it was a friend of mine who looked at that kind of budding body of work at Food 52 and said, I wonder if there's a larger project simmering in here. And forgive the food word there, that was totally unintentional. But he suggested, maybe there is a book in here about immigration and food in America. And I was 25 at that point, and I said, oh, please, I'm 12 years old, basically. I am far too young to take on a project like this right now. And so I just kind of put it, in the back of my mind. And fast forward a year later, when I was, 26, suddenly, so wise, so sage, so old.
Desert and seasoned.
Exactly, right? So much life experience in that year. And I decided I was freelance at that point. I had resigned from my food writing job that was full time. And I kind of struck it on my own. And I thought, okay, this is kind of the perfect time for me to pursue a deeper kind of book project. And I had noticed that over the course of that year, so many narratives within the American food media popped up along the lines of immigrants get the job done and immigrants feed America. And, I found those a little bit unsettling because I could understand that, those talking points were very likely well-intentioned, yet to me, they seem to inadvertently reinforce this idea that the value of immigrant lives in America should be based and measured on one's productivity and what they provide to a certain kind of consumer who is privileged. And that consumer is often white, middle to upper middle class, and so on and so forth. And I wanted to write against that impulse, even for people who may have kind of shared my political viewpoints, along with those who did not and were on the other side of the aisle. And so that is how Tastemakers was born. I asked myself, okay, you are a young writer and you've got a pretty limited skill set in terms of the stories that you tell. So how can you kind of push against these tropes subtly and in a small way? And so that is when I had the idea to stitch these 7 portraits together. So it was late 2018 when I sold this book.
And you've just led into my next question. Fantastic.
Yeah.
There are, of course, more than 7 people who have shaped American cuisine. How did these 7 make the cut?
Oh yeah, it was definitely a tough kind of curation process, one could say. I will preface all of this by saying that the 7 figures who were in my proposal that I sold in late 2018 are not the same 7 women who ended up in this book. And we can talk about why in a second. But, I found subjects or individuals to write about, rather. I prefer that to subjects. Through searching 2 terms in particular. The first was the Julia Child of, and the second was Craig Claiborne called her. So I'll explain both of those. So the Julia Child of, I Googled that and I looked at that on ProQuest and other research databases because throughout, the history of American food writing and food writing globally, I think that so many figures in the food world have been tagged with this sort of comparison to Julia Child, who is Titan, a force one I deeply respect and admire. Yet so many figures have been compared to her, and they've been called the Julia Child of their respective countries of origin or the regions from which they hailed. For example, the great Black Southern chef Edna Lewis has been called the Julia Child of the South in a way that I think that so many, at least whose orbit I'm in food media today, find so reductive and kind of patronizing because it just implies that these women cannot stand on their own and that their worth must be legitimized based on this comparison to Julia Child. And so I found a lot of individuals whom I could write about who had been called the Julia Child of Indian cooking and the Julia Child of Italian cooking, like Marcella Hazan, who was a Florida resident for the final few years of her life. And along with Norma Shirley, who was also, she has connections to Florida, and she was called the Julia Child of Jamaica and the Julia Child of the Caribbean. So that was one way I found some people to write about, and the other was Craig Claiborne called her. So in case you're not familiar with Craig Claiborne, those of you in the audience, Craig Claiborne was the food editor at the New York Times beginning in 1957. And, throughout the duration of his post there, which he held until, I believe, the mid-1980s, he championed many immigrant female voices, including a lot of the women in my book. These were previously figures who had been anonymous to the public, yet, through being written about by Craig Claiborne, they were suddenly catapulted to a degree of visibility that they did not have before. And through just the simple profile in the New York Times, they would get access to cookbook deals and other publishing channels that allowed them to become the stars that they were in their time. And yet, those are not necessarily figures whom today's cultural memory really honors and celebrates. And so I discovered so many names throughout just those 2 kind of Googling processes. So those are the 7 women who, or rather, that's how I found the 7 women whom I initially had in my proposal. But to finish answering your question, those are not the 7 women who ended up in my book. Because when I set out to actually write the book, so many of the figures whom I've chosen are no longer with us. And one of the most fun aspects of this sort of subgenre of food writing that I've been grateful to indulge in over the past few years has been digging through the archives and talking to sources who knew these people so I could kind of revive the memory of these folks. Yet what I needed to find in each woman's case was material that presented them speaking in their own voice so I could hear them in their own words. And oftentimes how I found that was through any surviving interviews they gave to the press, whether that was audio or written, any memoirs they had left behind, any cookbooks with autobiographical passages. And in the case of a few of the individuals whom I had in my proposal, that material just did not exist. And I didn't want to shortchange their narratives in any way by kind of shoehorning them into a book where I got to tell everyone else's story in a more robust way. So some stories fell by the wayside, and I had to really look for that sort of first-person material, for lack of a better term.
You mentioned Norma Shirley. I want to mention her too.
Yeah.
She is the last profile in your book, and I got to write about you and her in the new issue of Edible South Florida, which has not made its way to you yet. I'm going to fix that.
That's okay.
Norma Shirley was a Jamaican chef who celebrated Caribbean cuisine at a time Craig Claiborne and that ilk kind of dismissed it.
Mm-hmm.
But she definitely left her mark on Miami in a very positive way.
Okay.
Why did you include her, and why did you end the book with her?
Absolutely. She was such an intriguing figure to me, and she was someone who was actually not in my initial proposal. So just a primer on Norma Shirley, in case anyone is unfamiliar in the audience. So Norma Shirley was born in Jamaica, and then she had a career as a nurse and a midwife in Europe and then New York. And it was in New York around the late 60s and early 70s where she started to dabble in cooking. She was someone who said that she could not boil water before she got married in the 60s. So she began kind of just cooking as sort of a hobby in the 70s in New York. And then she moved to the Berkshires in Massachusetts with her then husband, a man named Michael Shirley. And it was there that she decided to abandon her line of work as a nurse and midwife and instead devote herself full time to cooking. And there she had her own picnic basket business. And then she was the chef at a restaurant called the Station Restaurants, where she cooked Jamaican food with, or rather French food with Jamaican flair, I believe is similar to kind of the terminology that she used. And oftentimes these were dishes that had just kind of a whisper here and there of her Jamaican roots. And then she decided after a few years to strike out on her own and try to, mount her own restaurants in New York. Yet, she was a Black immigrant woman from the Caribbean who was trying to, find a home and platform in New York in the early 1980s for a cuisine and style of cooking that so much of the food establishment of that era just was not willing to understand or even throw enough capital at for her to actually have that restaurant survive. So
you also point out a couple different places within the book that there are times when we love the cuisine, but we do not like the people who bring them to us. So there is that cultural dissonance.
Absolutely, yeah, and you definitely see some of that with Norma Shirley's, story. She faced, at least per my research, what I've gathered is that she faced so much discrimination in so many ways. Just in navigating those two spaces, the Berkshires, and then New York's dining and culinary scene. So after a few years, she decided that, it was not worth trying to realize this vision of opening her own Jamaican restaurant in New York. So instead what she did was she returned to Jamaica, and she realized her sort of dream and intention which was to cook for her own people and to get Jamaicans to really see just the beauty of the ingredients that existed on the island, and for them to really respect that. And then it was only after she returned to Jamaica in 1986, I believe was the year, although some sources say 1985, that she really became a star in the American food media's eyes. That, just a few years later, you start to see American magazines call her the Julia Child of Jamaica and the Julia Child of the Caribbean. But then that is actually how I found her. I was searching that term, the Julia Child of, and I was like, oh, Norma, But initially I was kind of hesitant to include her because she's someone who, she did maintain some connections to America. Her son, Delius Shirley, along with his life and business partner, Cindy Hudson, they've had restaurants in Florida, including Ortonique on the Mile. I hope that I'm pronouncing that correctly, which was a casualty of the pandemic in 2020, but was very beloved, at least from what I know. And she maintained that sort of connection to America, but otherwise she was, firmly rooted in Jamaica. Yet I wanted to make a statement in ending my book on her, in the sense that I wanted my readers to understand that, you might come to this book thinking that America is this wonderful melting pot that is so welcoming to different cuisines and cultures. Yet some people, to realize their creative visions in full, they have to return home. They have to leave America for that to happen, and for the American food establishment and the American food media to show them the respect that their talent really merits. And so what I saw in Norma Shirley's story was that of a woman who found America inhospitable in key ways, or at least the America of the 1980s. And she only had to go back home and create and cook for her own community to get the wide recognition and respect that she really deserved. So.
Yeah, I liked that she did it on her own terms.
Right, totally. And I find that so aspirational, just this idea that you can, I don't know, find so much fulfillment creating for your own people. Because when I look back at my very short, food writing career over the past 5 years, I haven't had that sort of, courage, to kind of put my own community first, because the realities of just kind of working as a young creative person, especially for marginalized communities, means that you're sometimes writing for a wider audience, and sometimes also people from the dominant culture. And what happens when you are writing for those people and creating for those people? Does something about the essence of the community that you come from get lost in translation? Those are things that I was thinking about constantly, as I was writing this book. And Norma's story made me be like, wow, she did it. She was creating for her own people, right on, so.
Leading on from that, this really is a perfect conversation. For those who are not Miami-based, there is a big food festival, South Beach Wine and Food Festival, which starts this week, and Miami is awash in celebrity chefs. Tastemakers explores the double edge of fame, and you hit on it a little earlier. Who benefits, who gets excluded, who gets a seat at the table or a multiple book deal, and who doesn't.
Right.
Can you talk a little more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. That was very much top of mind as I was crafting each of these stories. And, I will say this, that, of the 7 women in my book, almost all of them had material privileges that have allowed them to have any visibility at all, the kind of visibility that allows me, someone who is living decades after they were working, to even write about them. These were women who, even if they were women of color, let's say, or from what some might call the global South, they had enough material privilege to, publish their own memoirs and cookbooks and so on and so forth. And so I do think that the American food media has often been quite class exclusionary, and I'm saying this as someone who's benefited from that. I come from a comfortably middle class background, but I think that a lot of the women in my book kind of share that sort of class affiliation, or at least those class comforts. But otherwise, I would say that per my research, I think proximity to gatekeepers, especially in cities like New York, really helps. I mentioned Craig Claiborne a few minutes ago, but he is a sort of supporting character in so many of these stories, in the sense that, he really gave a lot of these women, even more visibility than they initially had. That's certainly true in the case of the aforementioned Marcella Hazan, who was working as a cooking teacher in New York when Craig Claiborne decided to visit her and then write about her, in the late 1960s, I believe. I hope I'm not misremembering that. And the same goes for a woman named Madeleine Camin, who came from France, who was just a, cooking teacher in Pennsylvania, who then was profiled by Craig Claiborne in the late 1960s. And then she became a big, celebrity chef in the Boston area. But a lot of these women had some sort of connection to the New York-based food media of the time that really was shaping, wider tastes in the country. And so I think that there's so many figures who were not noticed by figures like Craig Claiborne or other names who kind of had power in the American food media, who just sort of fell by the wayside, and they're figures whom I have not been able to write about in this book. And that's why I try to be as sensitive as possible in the afterword of my book, in the sense that, I was in that afterword, which I hope the audience will read. I basically say, to my fellow food writers, if we must call ourselves that, or if I must call myself that, I hope that we are more diligent about earning the trust of sources who come from marginalized communities, be that, racially disadvantaged or marginalized rather, or socioeconomically, so on and so forth. And, either giving them the tools and capital to tell their stories on their own terms, i.e. through memoirs, for example, or cookbooks, or, telling their stories in a way that is sensitive, because I just seeing kind of the gaps in the archives while I was writing this book kind of upset me and disturbed me, because, this book is very much in the realm of celebrity, in the sense that all these women to some extent were celebrity chefs in their time. They may not have had the longevity that their talents really deserved, in popular memory. And so why is it that they kind of fell by the wayside? That's something that I was asking myself. But.
There is, I think the media has played a part in that. Food has become entertainment in this country. We'll watch a fawning piece about a celebrity chef, but we don't always want to take a hard look at inequities in the food system.
Mm-hmm.
So how can we fix that?
Oh, how can we fix that? I think that, for one, there needs to be a reframing of just the way that we, tell the stories of creatives in the food world, if they're chefs, cookbook authors, what have you. And forgive me for using the term creative. It's such a cringe term, but I don't know what else really applies that's all-encompassing in that regard. But one of the things that I write about in my introduction to the book is that I wanted to reframe this notion, or kind of reorient my readers away from this notion of culinary greatness being the product of individualistic genius. It's very, just as someone who, did not really grow up consuming too much food writing, I think that what kind of shocked me was just its fixation on food storytelling, its fixation on the individual, like the person in power is often the chef, the celebrity chef, who has already, a lot of visibility sometimes. And I often wondered, well, if you're focusing on the celebrity chef who, owns X restaurant, what about the people under them? What about the people who don't have as much power and visibility, who are making that, engine run, day after day, the people who are line cooks in a restaurant, let's say, for example. And, and as a result, that is why I thought that a group biography would be such an attractive sort of format, in the sense that, it's very easy to say Julia Childs shaped Food America, or James Beard did, or, Craig Claiborne did. And I want to say, no, it was a group effort. And these are just 7 names. There are 7,000 more names I could have had, in this book, or 700, let's say, or 70. I don't know. Gotta, put that number down a bit. But, I think that what I'd like to see more of is just kind of acknowledgement that, in food storytelling, that greatness is the product of collective labor, rather than the labor of just one person who is already kind of at the top, sitting at the top of a certain hierarchy. And so I know that the kind of natural question or response to that might be, well, Mayukh, then why did you, focus on just one woman in each of these chapters? Aren't you just furthering that kind of fixation on the individual, and so on and so forth? And
it's good that you put a human face on a lot of issues that we are dealing with now. Me Too, the fight for 15, Black Lives Matter. No, you made it very human and very relatable.
Yeah, I'm glad you see it that way, because I think that a lot of these women, even if they did, achieve a degree of celebrity in their lifetimes, they had to fight, so much nasty discrimination to even get that sort of visibility. I'm thinking, for example, of the aforementioned Madeleine Camin from France. She was a white French-born woman, right? That she faced so much just casual misogyny from the American food media, who would call her abrasive and angry, and just use words that, today so many of us recognize as sexist dog whistles, but, back in the 70s and 80s, that was just kind of, part of a common parlance when it came to describing, women who had something that was maybe unpopular to say and something that threatened, people in power, and so I think that each of these women in my book, each of these 7 women, they had a version of that fight or multiple fights that they had to wage just to, get any sort of respect from the establishment. And I wanted to surface that certainly and kind of, draw the lines to how food media, has become the way it is today. Because, not to yap on too much, but I will say that I was writing this book in 2019, and though I had faced so much discrimination in the food world, just in my own, like, individually, that was before June 2020, when publications like Bon Appetit and the LA Times food section went through very public upheavals after controversies surrounding how the editors in charge allegedly treated, folks from marginalized communities who were on those mastheads. And I think that those sorts of incidents really exposed a larger audience to just how deep these ills of discrimination run in the American food media, And so as I was kind of doing edits on my book, I was like, how do I kind of, make sure that thread is as vibrant as possible, connecting the stories of the past to whatever chaos, so many of us in the field are dealing with in the present day. And so I hope that does come through.
When I tell people I'm a food writer, they say, "Oh, can you get me into that restaurant?"
Yeah.
Or like, "Do you know Ina Garten?" I think being a food writer is so much more than that. But let me ask you, what's a food writer?
Oof, yeah, great question. One that keeps me up at night. I have to say, I have been so hesitant to even call myself a food writer these days, because I think the term food writer implies to so many people a sort of skill set that I just do not possess. And I try to be transparent about that. Like I said earlier, I am, I came to this industry as someone who's not an avid home cook, and I remain that. I will probably burn my dinner tonight unless I'm heating up leftovers, and I am not a restaurant enthusiast. If you ask me for restaurant recommendations, I'm going to say, well, I don't know, check Yelp or something, just like something very embarrassing, right? But I think that, what is so attractive to me about writing about food is that, food touches everything. It can reveal so much about, who we are, where we come from, the cultures that shaped us, the dynamics that shaped us. And it's that sort of window. And, I think that a lot of people might not recognize that it has that sort of versatility and, can provide that sort of broader insight. But I really tried my best, from, early on in my career as a food writer, quote unquote, to honor that, and to see food as a way to talk, more generally about social issues and just humanity at large. And that might sound very overreaching or vague, but, as I was writing this book, what was actually tough was just to make sure that the food was alive on the page as much as possible, because, as someone who comes to food writing with this sort of the sensibility of a generalist, the food as an object has sometimes been the least compelling aspect of the writing to me. Always I've tried to put the writing before the food itself, but I know that so many of my readers will come to this book being like, I want to feel hungry, because one of the sort of unspoken imperatives of food writing is to make your reader hungry, right? And so I needed to make sure after I was done crafting each chapter to, make sure that food was alive on the page in some way, and that, I was conveying for my reader what food made each of these women feel, and it was kind of through just putting myself through that exercise that I realized how much I love food writing, or writing about food rather, because I did not grow up kind of, honoring and respecting food as a tool of creative expression. I grew up in a very patriarchal kind of household and the community that did not honor the labor of women like my mother, for example, who, fed me and others in our orbit so tirelessly. And I was conditioned to sort of see just, her food as sort of performance of duty, when in fact it was, a kind of art on its own, right? And so I came to food writing being fascinated by this idea that someone could see food as art and see home cooking as an art that was worthy of respect, and then create a career out of it and survive doing what they loved in that respect, you know? So that sense of wonder, I do hope, has come through on the page to some extent, but who knows?
No, it definitely did. And I know our audience has a lot of questions,
Oh,
but
boy.
do I have a chance to ask one more? Okay. It's a bonus question, and you're going to get a lot of it. You've already signed a second book, and we are all very excited. But from Tastemakers, you are doing a profile of the gorgeous actress Merle Oberon.
Mhm.
Okay, so why her and why not food? Was it something we said?
Yeah, it's your fault. No, yeah. So I am writing a biography of the Indian-born old Hollywood actress Merle Oberon, whom many people might know as Kathy in the 1939 version of Wuthering Heights with Laurence Olivier as Heathcliff. She had a fascinating story. She was the first woman of color, whom we know of at least, who was nominated for Best Actress Oscar back in 1936. She also concealed her South Asian origins throughout her life and instead passed for white. So her story has intrigued me since I was a kid. You know, I was just so I was taken by her screen presence, and before I even knew that she had roots in the same part of the world that I do. And I'd always wanted to write about her. And I grew up wanting to be a film critic, as you kind of intimated before. And so I decided, you know, after Tastemakers, that I wanted to kind of return to those roots. And I know that some people might be surprised at that jump, being like, oh, you know, he's got these credentials in the food world, or this sort of recognition, and he has this book about food. Like, why isn't he writing about food, right? And I think that one of my fears is that I will lock myself into food writing when, in fact, there are so many different registers that I want to continue to explore throughout my career. I love writing about food so much, but you know, there's a ceiling on the kinds of stories that I can tell, in the sense that, you know, I do have those limitations that we mentioned earlier, as someone who's like burning his dinner, setting off a fire alarm every night in his apartment, you know, whenever he's hovering over the stove. And, you know, I realized too that I've been so fortunate over the past few years to get any sort of recognition that I had from food media and the food establishment. When in fact there are so many other people who are younger than me, who are far more talented than me, who are more hardworking than me, who deserve a lot of what I have been given. And I do not want to take up too much space, you know, in American food media when, you know, there are other people who could maybe do what I am trying to do much better, you know? And so I will be working on this Merle Oberon book for the next few years, and I will, you know, continue to still have a foot in food writing, I hope, and tell some food stories. But I'm so excited to see, you know, other writers try to write this book in a much better, more just innovative way than I've been able to. I want to be wowed by those people, you know, so I'm excited to be a consumer in that regard.
Well, you have really just knocked me out with Tastemakers. I know a lot of other people are going to feel the same way.
Hope so.
Do we have some questions? I think we do.
Yes. Hello, everyone. So we have 3 audience questions at the moment. Please feel free to ask some more if there's anything that's on your mind. And let's get
There are no zingers. Let's see.
Okay, first one is from Gretchen. Any young chefs who are immigrants or whose parents are immigrants you're excited about these days?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. Oh my goodness. You know, I think the young is kind of throwing me off a bit, because I don't want to limit myself to age in particular. Oh my goodness. Oh man. You know, I am so embarrassed to be blanking on her name right now. But the chef at there's a Brooklyn restaurant called Soulful, which is an Iranian restaurant. She is I don't believe that people might classify her as young, and I'm so embarrassed to be forgetting her name right now because I was just thinking about her yesterday. But she is someone whose food has really, knocked me out whenever I have had the fortune of the good fortune of visiting her restaurants. So I will pull up her name in a second, and please forgive me for blanking on it right now. And another name or pair of names rather that comes to mind. They're a mother-daughter team, both named Nuri, and they run a restaurant in Jersey City called Karai Kitchen. And any of you who have seen the recent HBO Max series hosted by Lisa Ling will have seen this restaurant profiled in that series. But they run this marvelous Bangladeshi restaurant in Jersey City called Karai Kitchen. And I had the great privilege of writing about them a few years ago. And they have since just, gotten even more well-deserved attention. But what I love about their ethos and their sensibility as a mother-daughter team is that they restore so much dignity to home cooking. And it's so similar to the home cooking that I grew up eating, in my household in New Jersey, which was also Bengali immigrant household, and to see them giving this sort of food that felt so commonplace but special to me as a child, a sort of platform in a restaurant, I find it so admirable and wonderful. And I hope that they will continue to have as much success as they have thus far. So I will draw up that Sofre chef's name in a second, but that's another pair of folks who come to mind immediately. So thank you for the question.
Thank you. All right. Our next question is, what did you enjoy the most about writing this book?
Ooh, that's a wonderful question. And easier, my goodness. I'm so embarrassed that I kind of flubbed that first one. There are a lot of fun parts of writing this book, and I will say one was truly, and this is going to sound so nerdy, but just fidgeting with the prose itself and the actual writing, writing a book can be a deadening process in a lot of ways, or very challenging in a way that, writing a dinky little piece that people are going to forget about in 2 days is not. But what I really relished about this project was just getting to sit in front of my computer and, be like, okay, does this sentence fit here or there? And, how do I massage this into this part of the narrative, And there's this sort of, rigorous self-editor in me too, in the sense that I was dealing with so much research material where I was like, oh, how do I condense this in a way that is readable and accessible to the wide audience whom I wanted to reach? And, the challenge of kind of figuring out how to condense, some of a woman's story while also, maintaining the essence of their story and making sure the reader got that essence was a blast, honestly. And I sound like a total nerd saying that, like, oh, I love the writing, I love the prose, fidgeting, all that stuff. But I think that truly did give me a lot of pleasure. And it made me realize that, if I must exist on this earth doing something, I guess it must be writing. Who knows how much people will like those words that I create or whatever, but at least it makes me happy. So that was the most fun part of this process, but there are a lot of other fun parts.
Thank you. And we also have someone said, would that chef's name be, and I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing, Nasim Ali Khani?
Yes, I believe so. Yes, I'm on airplane mode on my phone, so I can't, look it up right now. But yes, that is exactly whom I'm thinking about. And Melissa Clark wrote a wonderful profile of her in the New York Times a few years back, right around the time that I believe the restaurant was launched. But I think that she deserves even more attention as well. So thank you for getting that name for me. I appreciate it.
All right. Okay. Our next and final question of the evening is there anything that surprised you when writing this book?
Ooh, no, there wasn't. Okay, no, just kidding. Yes, of course, there was a lot. And I will say one of the surprising things was just seeing how casually discriminatory so many American food writers were once upon a time. And I think that some food writers and food journalists have maybe become a little more sly and subtle about the ways in which they expose their discriminatory tendencies. But there are moments in my research that just kind of shocked me. For example, I talked earlier about how when I was spending time with Madeline Cameron's story, there are so many articles that just took pleasure in calling her, arrogant and abrasive and all these other words that were just so plainly sexist and, reducing her many achievements to this sort of attitude that so many people in the dominant culture seem to have an allergy to. And I found that was so unfair. Why not celebrate her for her many, many achievements and her very clear talents rather than, what you perceive to be a sort of a prickly, quote unquote, personality. There was one line in a book that I remember stumbling upon that was saying something like, surely when, she dies, there will be no Food Network eulogies for her. And I was just like, what a cool thing to say about someone, especially someone who's proven her worth so much. So there was stuff like that, and then in addition to that, and I guess it's fitting that we're ending on this, when it came to the story of Norma Shirley, there was a line in a 1999 Esquire, I believe, roundup of, the year's best new restaurants. And I believe it was praising Ortonique on the Mile, which I mentioned earlier in this conversation. It had opened that year, around that year, I believe. And the reviewer, whom I will not name, although I name him in the book, said something along the lines of, Jamaica does not leap to mind immediately when one thinks of great food. And I just found it so nakedly racist, to dismiss an entire country's language of cooking just in one fell swoop, so casually. I found it quite shocking, and so I don't think that the spores of this sort of discriminatory attitude have really disappeared in American food writing, but I like to think that maybe people are more subtle about expressing that sort of hateful behavior. But I do hope that moving forward, there's absolutely no place for that in American food media, because it's made my life hard and it's made the lives of these 7 women quite hard, and no one deserves to be dealing with those challenges when they're just trying to do what they love, which is make food and tell stories around it. So,
okay, so I have another question for you.
Okay.
What's America's food narrative now? I mean, when your Columbia students try and write the story of what's happening in food now, what does it look like?
Oh man, yeah. Well, I would say that I try to tell them to focus on figures from marginalized communities, first of all, especially those who do not have much visibility in traditional narratives. We're reading lots of these well-executed, classic kind of, chef profiles, that are, the finest examples of a form that has its many limitations. And what I tell them, and what I've told my students at NYU, which is where I was teaching from 2019 until very recently, before Columbia, was, turn your attention to, line cooks at a restaurant, or cashiers at a grocery store, or farmers and other figures who exist on the margins of, cultural memory, let's say, and deserve attention for their labor because their work is so integral to the ways in which, so many American consumers get their food today and also think about their food today. And so I do hope that more attention continues to turn towards those people and away from the folks who've already got their lovely Food Network shows. So I hope that answers the question.
It does wonderfully.
Thank you.
Thank you. And actually, we do have one more question. So Gretchen says, me again, from your perspective, which cuisines seem undiscovered and deserving of attention in U.S. cities these days?
Ooh, that's a wonderful question. I mean, the obvious kind of answer is Bengali and Bangladeshi food, because for so long it has sort of existed in the shadow of North Indian cooking in particular. There is this really fascinating kind of history in major American, metropolitan areas of chefs and cooks from what is today Bangladesh, starting nominally Indian restaurants in places like New York, for example, and cooking food that is not necessarily recognized by the larger culture as Bengali and Bangladeshi. And I have seen this sort of greater visibility in the past few years for Bengali food and Bangladeshi food specifically, but you can always use more. So that is kind of one cuisine that leaps to mind, and it's kind of an obvious answer because it's the one that I grew up with, right? I would also love to see even more appreciation for Eritrean food, and I say that because one of the stories that I unfortunately wanted to write about, but then could not, as I began kind of putting this book together, was that of an Eritrean chef named Desta Bayru, whom I mention in my afterword to the book. But she is someone who was the chef of the first Ethiopian restaurant in Washington, D.C. in the late 1970s. It was called Mama Desta's. And obviously Ethiopian cooking has a very visible, at least to my mind, imprint on the larger American food landscape, especially in cities like Washington, D.C., yet, something that was really fascinating to me that I heard from some sources as I was trying to report that chapter was that, Desta herself as the chef, she had some sort of Eritrean influences that she was trying to kind of mix into her cooking that, may have kind of flown over the heads of, some of the American food media and critics who wrote about her at that time, so that made me wonder, why is it that so many, people in the dominant culture, let's say, might not be able to distinguish between Ethiopian cooking and Eritrean cooking and the, different valences between the two? So that is something else that comes to mind. So I hope that answers your question.
All right. Well, those are all the questions that we have left. And just wanted to say thank you to you, Mayukh and Ellen, for being here tonight with us. And thank you, everyone who joined and asked your questions. And don't forget to purchase the book from Books and Books by clicking this green button, our website, or in store if you're in Miami.
Yes.
And thank you both.
Thank you so much. Truly appreciate it. Thank you, Gretchen, everyone else who asked questions. And thank you, Ellen, for your wonderful moderation. I appreciate it.
It is wonderful to see you again. It is wonderful to be doing this through Books and Books, our beloved local indie. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye.